Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Bucharski back here again today with a new math video. And today we are going to be talking about subtracting integers. Now, as I mentioned before, subtracting integers can be confusing, but with some practice, you'll pick it up pretty easily. And what I mean by that is with adding integers, for example, I uploaded, I think, 4 assignments. And when I started marking them, the vast majority of people were doing very well with them. And when I do this with students in the class, after a day of adding integers, I normally get 15 out of the 20 students get it right away, and 5 more will get it in a few more classes. With subtracting, I usually get about 5 or 6 kids who get it right away. After a few days, about 5 more, and then after a few days, about 5 more. So it can be a little bit frustrating. And I'll explain why it can be a little frustrating. When I was in school, and if you want to go back to, often when your parents were in school, they taught what was often referred to as the rule with subtracting integers. It's also another rule that applies for multiplying and dividing integers. And as long as you applied the rule, you would get the answer correct. And in the 1980s and 90s, that was perfectly acceptable for teachers to just get that answer and you're good. The math curriculum today is not satisfied with just doing the rule. It wants students to understand why that rule works. So in order to do this, I'm going to be showing you both ways. I'm going to show you the rule and how it applies, and then I'm going to show you the way to model the rule and how it will actually work with individual questions. And the modeling part is what can be a bit tricky. Now, before we get started, let's simply talk about that rule. Now, with adding integers, you would have noticed something, and it's also a rule, but I didn't need to tell you it was a rule because most of you figured it out on your own. And that is, if you are adding a negative, it's the same thing as taking away a positive, right? So for example, this can also be written as positive 6 take away positive 2. Okay, so it can be written as though you're taking away a negative. So adding a negative and taking away a positive is the same thing. Both of these answers are going to be positive 4. And you guys probably realized that. Now, that being said, that is a rule, but it's not really has to be stated because most of you just get it, okay? But with subtracting, it's not as obvious, but it is still there. So there is a rule, and I'd like you to remember this rule because it's very important and it's going to come up a lot. I often encourage kids to write it down at the top of their paper. And the rule simply states, when you subtract a negative, it is the same as adding a positive. Okay? So when you're subtracting a negative, it's the same as adding a positive. Now, I remember teachers when I was in school saying, if you had 2 negative symbols, for example, you had negative 6 take away negative 4, you would just simply change them to adding. And they were right. That did work. We often call that, and in the textbooks we use today, it's referred to as changing the operation. And it's the exact same thing. Okay? So this rule, when you subtract the negative, it is the same as adding a positive, is also the same rule the other way around. When you subtract a positive, it is the same as adding a negative. Okay, so the rule works both ways. So you could also do it as when you subtract a positive number, it's the same thing as adding a negative number. So we just call these reversing the operations or changing the operations. And you'll see this in your textbooks quite a bit. So let's just do a couple examples. But as I do these examples, I want you to pause and do them with me. But also I'm going to show you how to model those as well. So let's start with a very simple one. -1 take away -3. Okay, so we have -1 take away -3. Remember, from our rule, taking away a negative is the same thing as adding a positive, okay? So we can just rewrite this as -1 adding a positive. So taking away a negative is the same thing as adding a positive. -1 plus +3, we've already done addition, would give us +2. -1 plus +3 equals +2 is the same thing as -1 taking away -3, because that will also equal +2. So the rule, or the changing the operation way, is relatively simple. It's very efficient, and it will get you the right answer every time. Let's try a different one though. +3 taking away +7. Okay, now remember, taking away a positive is the same thing as adding a negative. So we can go +3 plus -7, because it's the same thing as adding a negative. And we had +3, we added -7, which means we're going to be left with -4. And that's also going to apply to your top answer. I'm sorry, I went out of frame there for a bit. Now, let's work on how we can model these, because that's where things get kind of interesting. And we're going to do it both ways, with the rule and with the modeling. We'll start with a relatively easy one. -7 take away -5. Okay. Now, remember, according to our rule, taking away a negative is the same thing as adding a positive. So if we wanted to do this without modeling it, we could just rewrite the operation to add the positive. -7 plus +5 equals -2. I had 7 negatives, I added 5 positives, but canceled out 5 of those negatives, and I'm left with -2. Modeling this out can be a little bit trickier. So let's try that out though. And we're going to use integer chips. You can do this with number lines, but I like to just keep it to 1. So let's work with integer chips. And we're going to use red for our negatives today. So this here, oh, apparently my red is dead. That's not good. I guess I'm going to have to go with my blue. So always begin with what you have, which is in this case -7. So I'm going to write 7 negative chips. I'm going to draw the signs. 4, 5, 6, and 7. Excellent. I have 7 negative chips. Now, I'm being asked to take away 5 of those negative chips. Well, that's actually quite easy, because I definitely have 5 to take away. So I can just take away 5 of those negative chips, and I can subtract them, get rid of them. And that leaves me with 2 negative chips, which is what we had for our answer originally. Remember, when we changed the operation, we went from -7, adding the positive to give us -2. So both of those answers work. So -7 take away -5 is the same thing as saying -7 plus +5, because subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. And if we had to model it, we had 7 negative chips, we removed 5 of those, and we were left with 2. So that's the very, very basic way to do this. Let's start with a little bit of a harder question. Let's look at -3 take away +2. Okay. Oh, that's out of frame. I apologize. Let's see if I can raise this up a little bit. That kind of helped. There we go. -3 take away +2. I didn't draw that positive very well. There we go. +2. Now, if I'm taking away a positive, it's the same thing as adding a negative. So I can just rewrite this equation, -3 plus negative 2 equals negative 5, because I had 3 negatives and I added 2 negatives, which gave me negative 5. Modeling this, however, is going to be a bit trickier. Let's see if we can do it, though. Always begin with what you have. I have 3 negatives, so let's just draw our 3 negative chips. Here's the problem. Do I have any positives to take away? And the answer is no, I don't. I don't have any positives. So how am I supposed to take away positives if I don't have any to take away? Well, that is going to be interesting. When we looked back to our very first lesson, we talked about zero pairs, or adding things to a number without changing the number itself. And I can do that here. So one way I can get 2 positive parts in here is by adding what we call 2 zero pairs. And I'm going to add in 2 zero pairs. Now these 0 pairs technically equal 0 because they cancel each other out. You see how that works? The number here, if I said what number is this, you would still say it's negative 3 and you'd be right. However, if you might have noticed, now I'm going to move that back down, I now have 2 positives that I can take away. So let's do that. Let's remove those 2 positives. Get rid of them. And if I got rid of those 2 positives, what would be left? Well, you'd have 5 negatives left. And look at that. That was our answer the whole time, negative 5. So 2 ways that we did this. I did it the fast and efficient and quick way of changing the operation, or following the rule that when I subtract a positive, I'm simply adding a negative. And I modeled it by starting with what I had, my negative 3, adding 2 zero pairs, so I don't change the number, but I do now give myself 2 positives to remove, and then ending up with 5 negatives. Let's try a couple more, because this, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is going to take some practice. This is not something that you're going to be, a lot of you are going to figure out on your first try. It's going to take a little bit of time, and that's okay. Let's start with one that you're going to probably see in some of your questions here. We're going to go with negative, let's go with positive 4, take away negative 1. I'm working with easy numbers here because we're going to be modeling these. I apologize, I keep going out of frame. I'm working with a very small space here. Now, remember, the rule says if I'm taking away a negative, that is the exact same thing as adding a positive. So let's just do that. Follow the rule. Positive 4, adding a positive. Well, 4 plus 1 is positive 5. So negative 4, take away negative 1, is positive 5, because it's the same thing as the rule tells us. If we add the opposite, or if we're taking away negative, we add a positive, that's where we end up. Let's model this one though. Start with 4 positives, because always start with what you have. There's 4 positives. But I'm not being asked to subtract positives. I'm being asked to take away a negative, and I don't have any negatives. So what we need to do, of course, we're going to keep our original 4 positives, is we are going to add 1 zero pair. There we go. Now, with our 0 pair, we do have 1 negative that we can remove, and here it is. So let's get rid of it. It's gone. And what's left over? 5 positives. Which was our answer from the beginning, positive 5. So I'm hoping that some of you are starting to see this here, that the easy way to do it, the rule, the quick, efficient way is just simply to change the operation. Modeling it does take a bit more work. But on the other hand, that's how the modeling works. And some of the questions are going to say simply just change the operation, and others are going to say please model it. There are less modeling questions though than there are just solving questions. Okay, so don't worry about that too much. Some of them are already going to have the models for you, so let's draw one of those. Some of these are going to be drawn already, and all you're going to need to do is write what the models show. Now, sometimes in the models, they actually kind of waste a step and go 2 rows. It doesn't mean anything different, really. So here's one model that you might see. You're going to see a few different ones. And again, I apologize for the camera here. I'm going to keep going back and forth. So always start with what you have. So if we look up here, we have 2 negatives. So let's start with -2. And we know we're subtracting. Okay? Now we go to the next line here. Oh, my bad. There we go. Let's try that now. Now, what happened here? Well, I have my original 2 negatives, but I added 2 0 pairs. Okay? I added 2 0 pairs. The number is still -2 because I haven't done anything yet. Now I come back here and I remove those 2 0 pairs. And because I'm removing them, I'm removing 2 positive integers. And then at the very end, once that's done, I'm left with 4 negative integers, which means my answer was -4. Now, let's reverse the operations and see if we get the right answer. -2, take away +2. The rule tells us when I take away a positive, it's the same thing as adding a negative. So -2 plus -2 equals -4. So you can always double check your work by just changing the operation around. Great. I want to talk about one last type of question you're going to see. And you're going to see these ones quite a bit. And it's going to say, find the difference. Now remember, difference always refers to subtraction. Find the difference of both integers. So you're going to see these types of questions coming up. And let's just do, one of them will be like -1 and +2, and then another one might be like -6 and -3. Now, what you probably notice right away is there's no operational sign here. And the reason why is because it already told us, find the difference, we're subtracting. This is where things get kind of a little bit interesting, okay? Now let's just work with the first one to figure this out. So let's start with this one. And we'll go -1, take away +2, okay? Now, remember, when I'm taking away a positive, it's the same thing as adding a negative. So I can rewrite my operation here. -1 plus -2 gives us -3. So -1 take away +2 is the same thing as saying -1 plus -2, which is -3. I could also model that if I wanted to, okay? If I wanted to model it, I would have my one negative. I would have to take away 2 positives. I don't have any positives, so I'm going to add myself 2 0 pairs here. Okay, and then once I do that, I'm going to remove the 2 positives, and that means I will be left with 3 negatives, which is, look at that, that's our answer, 3 negatives. Okay, so we've done -1, take away +2, and when we did that, we came up with the answer of -3. Now, these questions often don't tell you how you can do it, so if you just want to change the operation, that's okay. But there's more than one way that I could find the difference between these numbers. I can do it the other way around. I can do +2, take away -1. Okay, I can do it the other way around. Now, with addition, if we were adding these, it wouldn't make a difference, because even if we switched the numbers around, you were going to end up with the same number. But with subtracting, something is going to change, and you're going to notice a pattern when you do these. So let's, again, follow the rule here. When I'm taking away a negative, it's the same as adding a positive. Okay? And 2 plus 1 gives us +3. Now, I could model that out, but I don't think we need to for this one. But either way, the answer becomes +3. So, whenever you have questions like this, you're going to notice that when you reverse them around, the only thing that changes is the positive and the negative. Okay, that's the only thing that changes. Let's try one final question. And we'll go here again, and this time we're going to do -6 and -3. Okay, so the first way we can write this is -6 take away -3, and the other way we can write this is -3 take away -6. Okay, remember our rule. Whenever I'm taking away a negative, it's the same as adding a positive. And -6 plus +3 gives us -3. And down here, remember the rule, when I'm taking away a negative, it's the same as adding a positive, same as before. So we have -3 plus +6 equals +3. So it's just the opposite. So whenever you have a question like this, solve one of them, you'll get your answer. The other way around is going to be the same answer, but the opposite operation, rather negative or positive. So whenever you see those questions that say, find the difference between both integers, you're just subtracting them two different ways. But as long as you find it one way, the other way is just simply reversing the operation. I want to make this very clear, guys. This is going to require some practice. Do not get frustrated if you're having trouble with it right away. Check with me for some help. Watch the video multiple times. There's other great videos on YouTube on subtracting integers. The one I'd recommend is Math Antics. He probably does the most clear job. He uses number lines and not integer chips, but he does a very, very good job of explaining it. Maybe a little too complicated, but you know, he still explains it well. And please come talk to me if you have any questions at all. And with a few different practices of some lessons, you will begin to slowly pick these up. The first assignment I'm going to give you is a very, very short one. It's not out of the textbook. It's just a few simple questions for you to try. Talk to you guys soon. Bye now.